The story of the medieval peasants did not end with the first sparks of revolt. If anything, those sparks began to spread into different corners of Europe, carried not just by anger but also by whispers, songs, and the stories of resistance. By the mid-14th and early 15th centuries, peasants had endured plague, famine, taxation, and endless wars. Now, they were beginning to imagine something once unthinkable, a life beyond the iron grip of their lords. Picture the muddy roads of France and England in this period. A weary traveler could move from one town to another and hear the same complaints echoing in taverns and village squares. The lords grow fat while our children starve. The church demands coin for prayers, but God listens without silver. Why should we toil in fields that are not ours? Such murmurs were dangerous, for in a world ruled by hierarchy, to even question one's place was an act of rebellion. And yet, the murmurs grew louder. One reason was the memory of the plague. The Black Death had changed everything. Entire villages had been wiped out, but those who survived suddenly found that their labor was more valuable. With fewer workers, fields went untended, harvests shrank, and lords became desperate. Peasants, for the first time in centuries, could demand wages or walk away in search of better opportunities. Some lords tried to chain them to the land again with harsh laws, but the age of absolute obedience was slowly cracking. Imagine the life of a young peasant man in this new reality. His father and two brothers had perished during the plague years. Now, only he and his mother remained to work their small strip of land. A steward from the manor demands high taxes, but in a nearby village, another lord is willing to offer him more freedom if he comes to work there. The choice is dangerous. To leave is to risk punishment, perhaps even death if caught. But the temptation of freedom is strong. This was not just his story, it was the story of thousands. The church, once a place of unquestioned authority, also began to face unrest. Priests had failed to stop the plague, prayers had not brought rain during famine, and indulgences, payments to the church for forgiveness, looked increasingly like fraud to the suffering poor. Though peasants were deeply religious, they began to doubt whether God's true will was reflected in the wealth and power of bishops and abbots. Secret preachers began to appear, speaking in the fields and villages instead of the pulpits. They told peasants that all men were equal before God, that the world belonged to all, not just the few. These ideas spread like wildfire. At the same time, feasts and festivals remained the beating heart of peasant life. After months of back-breaking labor, they would gather for harvest festivals, where music, ale, and dances filled the night. But even in joy, the shadow of rebellion lingered. Ballads sung by traveling minstrels often contained veiled messages, tales of poor men defeating greedy kings, or of a just order where land was shared. For those who listened carefully, such songs were more than entertainment, they were inspiration. And then came the wars. The 100 Years' War between England and France drained resources from both kingdoms. Lords demanded higher taxes to fund battles fought far away. Soldiers marched through villages, seizing food and leaving devastation. Peasants, who already lived on the edge of survival, found themselves paying for wars that brought them no benefit. Resentment turned into fury. The mid-14th century also saw the rise of the Jacquerie in France 1358, a massive peasant revolt sparked by unbearable taxes and the cruelty of nobles. Villagers armed themselves with farming tools, stormed manor houses, and for a brief moment, the world turned upside down. Though brutally suppressed, the revolt sent a message: peasants would no longer suffer silently. In England, a similar wave built up, leading to the famous Peasants' Revolt of 1381. But even before that explosion, small acts of defiance were everywhere. Peasants hid grain from tax collectors, refused to obey new wage restrictions, and sometimes simply walked away from their villages to seek a new life elsewhere. Each act chipped away at the old order. Women, too, played their part. In famine years, they organized networks to share food, cared for the sick, and in times of revolt, they stood alongside men in the fight. Chroniclers, often hostile to peasants, still recorded with astonishment how women shouted curses at tax collectors or even threw stones at soldiers. Their courage was undeniable. Life remained cruel, of course. Famines returned, plagues struck again in smaller waves, and lords continued to demand service. But a new spirit had been born in the villages of medieval Europe, the spirit of survival with dignity. Imagine walking through a medieval village at this time. You would see thatched cottages patched with mud and straw, smoke curling from their chimneys. In one, a family eats a thin soup of beans and cabbage. In another, a grandmother tells stories of the time before the Great Death. At the tavern, men whisper about rumors of revolt. And at the edge of the village, a young woman sings a song of hope, her voice carrying into the night. These were not the voices recorded in grand chronicles or royal archives. But they were the voices that kept humanity alive. The lords may have built castles, but the peasants built survival itself. And as the 14th century gave way to the 15th, their struggle was only beginning. The murmurs of discontent that had echoed through Europe for decades finally erupted in one of the most extraordinary uprisings of the Middle Ages, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England. By this time, the memory of the Black Death was still fresh. Whole families had vanished, villages lay half empty, and yet those who survived carried scars of loss but also a newfound sense of worth. Labor was scarce, and peasants knew it. But instead of granting them freedom, the ruling class tightened its grip. In 1351, the English crown had passed the Statute of Labourers, a law that tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It declared that no peasant could demand higher pay, and no master could offer more than the law allowed. This might have pleased the lords, but to the workers who had risked life and limb in the fields, it was an insult. Imagine watching half your village buried in plague pits, only to be told your labor was worth no more than before. Resentment grew year by year. And then came the taxes. To fund the endless war with France, the English crown demanded a poll tax, a flat tax every man and woman, rich or poor, had to pay. For the wealthy, it was nothing. For a starving peasant family, it was a death sentence. Collectors went from village to village, demanding coin with threats and cruelty. The spark came in Essex and Kent, when villagers refused to pay. Tax collectors were driven out, sometimes beaten, sometimes killed. The rebellion spread like wildfire. Soon thousands of peasants, artisans, and even townsfolk were marching toward London under the leadership of men like Wat Tyler and inspired by fiery sermons from radical preachers such as John Ball, who declared, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" It was a dangerous question, one that struck at the very foundation of feudal society. If in the beginning all men were equal, then who gave kings and lords the right to rule over others? Imagine the sight, tens of thousands of common folk marching along the dusty roads of England, carrying not swords and armor but pitchforks, scythes, and whatever tools they could find. Some wore simple cloth banners painted with slogans of freedom. Women marched alongside men, children too. They sang songs of justice and shouted for an end to bondage. When they reached London, the city gates opened, not by force, but because many inside sympathized with them. The rebels poured into the capital, their numbers swelling. They stormed prisons, freeing captives. They burned the houses of royal officials and destroyed records of debts and taxes. To peasants who could neither read nor write, the sight of parchment and ink going up in flames was liberation itself. The young King Richard II, barely 14 years old, faced an impossible situation. His advisors panicked, nobles fled, and the capital was in chaos. Yet Richard rode out to meet the rebels. At Mile End, he promised reforms, freedom from serfdom, fair rents, and justice for all. The crowd erupted in joy. Many believed victory had come at last. But the story did not end there. Wat Tyler, the charismatic leader of the revolt, pushed for more. At a second meeting in Smithfield, he pressed the king to go further, to abolish lordship itself and make all men free. But at that moment, tensions exploded. Accounts differ, but most say that in the heated exchange, royal knights attacked Tyler. He was struck down, stabbed, and left to die. The peasants, shocked, looked to their young king. Richard, showing remarkable courage for his age, rode forward and called out, "I am your leader now, follow me." For a moment, his words calmed the crowd. Confused, grieving, and leaderless, many began to disperse. And then came the betrayal. Once the rebels had gone home, Richard revoked his promises. The royal army hunted down leaders, villages were punished, and executions filled the countryside. John Ball was captured and hanged, drawn, and quartered. The dream of freedom seemed crushed. But though the revolt was suppressed, its impact could not be erased. Never again would the ruling elite feel entirely safe. They had seen what happened when the common people rose together. The idea that peasants were voiceless and powerless had been shattered forever. And perhaps more importantly, seeds had been planted, seeds of resistance that would blossom in later centuries. Serfdom in England began to decline after this period, slowly but surely. By the 15th century, many peasants were no longer bound to the land as their ancestors had been. Freedom, once a dream, was becoming reality. Let us pause and imagine life in the aftermath. In a small English village, a family gathers around the hearth. The father tells his children about the Great March to London, about how they saw the king face to face, about how their leader died but their courage lived on. The children listen wide-eyed, and though they return to their work in the fields the next morning, something inside them has changed. They now know that even the lowliest plowman has a voice. This was the true legacy of the revolt. It was not just about taxes or wages. It was about dignity, about being recognized as human beings with rights and worth. Meanwhile, across Europe, other uprisings echoed the same struggle. In Flanders, in Germany, in Italy, peasants rose again and again. Each revolt was crushed, but each left a scar on the old order. The medieval world was slowly cracking, preparing the way for the transformations of the Renaissance and beyond. The story of medieval peasants is not one of defeat, but of endurance. They endured plague, famine, and tyranny. They endured broken promises and brutal punishments. And yet, they carried forward the torch of survival, passing it from one generation to the next. Their lives may not fill the pages of royal chronicles, but without them, there would have been no fields harvested, no bread baked, no castles built. They were the backbone of medieval society, and in their moments of defiance, they reminded the world that even the humblest lives could shake kingdoms. So, when we look back at the dark and bloody 14th century, let us not only see the kings, the battles, or the plagues. Let us also see the peasants, the men, women, and children who tilled the soil, suffered, hoped, and sometimes rose to demand a better world. And their story is not yet finished.